So there's this conversation that's culturally prevalent right now. I see it on social media, I see it on regular media, and it involves this key word. Let's throw it up there. Oh, wait, hold up. See if you can read that. This is a vision test. Right now, there we go. Goat. Now, I'm not talking about the small farm animal, which is super creepy, and I don't want to talk about it. We'll never preach about goats. What I am talking about is the acronym greatest of all time. Show of hands, who's heard of this? Used in this way. Okay, who here knows what an actual farm animal goat is? Should be every hand. Okay, thank God. Okay, just see what we're working with here. All right, greatest of all time. People argue about this. I listen to a lot of sports radio. I'm into sports, and people talk about this all the time when it comes to like quarterbacks. Who's the greatest quarterback of all time? Man, I wish it wasn't, but it is. Yeah, some people say like Joe Montana. Other people say, nah, it's Tom Brady. And then other people might be homers and they'll be like, it's Matt Ryan. And I'm like, get out of here. You're irrelevant to the conversation. Okay? Quit being such a homer all the time. Or people talk about who's the greatest basketball player of all time. Michael Jordan or LeBron James. And he came on one-on-one. Could Jordan handle the sheer just physicality of LeBron James? But Jordan won more. But what about LeBron? What about Jordan? Who's the GOAT? And again, I don't want Atlanta people to be homers here and be like, Christian Laettner? I don't know. He played for the Hawks, right? Yeah, get out of here with Christian Laettner. Who's the GOAT? People talk about baseball. Who's the greatest? Babe Ruth? I would argue no. See, Babe Ruth had to hit a home run every time so he could get around the bases on time. Because if you've ever seen a picture of Babe Ruth, that man, I am surprised he was able to run the bases. That's back when you could like smoke and drink in the dugout. Not a great athlete. But some people say Babe Ruth is the greatest. Some people say Hank Aaron. Some people say Barry Bonds with help. And so that was a burn. So people argue about who's the GOAT. No, this isn't just relegated to sports, though. We talk about this in art. So people would say, like some people would say, my wife would probably say this, Beyonce is the GOAT. Greatest singer of all time. Greatest performer of all time. Beyonce. Some people would say, the Beatles are the GOAT. The greatest band of all time. Some people would say Tom Hanks is the GOAT, the greatest actor of all time. We take this discussion to many different things. It's because, this is kind of our premise, our starting point today, we live in a culture, the culture of our day values greatness and fame and power and money. And all these people we talk about and argue about, they've got all of it. And so by cultural norms and standards today, they are great people, and we argue about their greatness. And it's because of this culture predicated on greatness and glory and fame. And quite frankly, it's easy to achieve those today. I mean, in terms of fame, people get famous just on their cell phone with YouTube and Instagram and things like that. So it's really easy. And in the culture we're blessed to live in, we're pretty affluent as a country. And so it's easy to achieve money and power. And so these are the things that we tend to focus on this word, desire. These are the things we desire. These are the things we chase. These are the things that are important to us. But here's the thing. This isn't a recent development. This isn't a new thing. This is, it's been this way for a minute. And in our passage today, the passage we're going to dive into, we're going to see how the culture of the day kind of clashes with the kingdom of heaven. You see, we all live by what's called a framing narrative. It's a story we live by. It's an ideology that we hold. And so I would say today, chasing the American dream of power and wealth and fame and glory, like that's kind of our framing story. And what we're going to, and it was the same in Jesus' day. But what we're going to see today is competing ideologies, kind of clashing narratives between the culture of this day and the kingdom of heaven. The culture of the day and the kingdom of heaven. And so to really look at this and really expound upon it, we're going to dive into Mark 10, 35 through 45. So you can get your Bibles out. You can get your Bibles out on your phone. You're going to want to follow along. We're going to put some scripture on the screen, but as I often do, I'm not going to take you through every single word and every single line of it. So you're going to want to have it open. Now, anytime I preach, you know it's really important to me to not parachute drop you into the passage. Because you have no idea what's going on. You don't know where we've been. You don't know where we're going. So I want to give you just a little bit of background on the book of Mark at the place we're kind of stepping on. And kind of an oversimplified outline and structure of Mark. you have this early passage in Mark where it's the early ministry of Jesus. Many miracles. Mark really emphasizes miracles too. Many miracles, some profound teachings, and kind of calling the disciples. And Mark doesn't waste any time. He just gets right to it. It's a lot of action. Jesus' early ministry, part 1 of Mark. Then there's this kind of transitional portion of Mark that we're going to be in today. And that actually leads and sets up the action for the end of Mark. And the end of Mark will be the Passion Week, when Jesus goes to Jerusalem and he's going to be arrested and tried and crucified and dead and raised again and ascended to heaven. So these are kind of the 3 sections of Mark. Early ministry, transition period, or this transitional part, and then you have the end of Mark. And it ends kind of at the cross and the resurrection. So we're stepping into this transitional part. It's a transition in the action. It's kind of like right before the third act of a movie. And it's setting up the third act of the movie. And it's going to foreshadow a lot of the third act of the movie, the end of the movie. And so in this portion of Mark, in chapters 9 and 10 specifically, Jesus talks a lot about the kingdom of heaven. And remember, what we're going to be looking at today is the culture of the day clashing with the kingdom of heaven, these competing narratives. Jesus is articulating very thoroughly in this passage what the kingdom of heaven is, what it looks like. Now, we've used this phrase, kingdom of heaven, a lot in this series. And Ben did a great job putting the series together and kind of conceptualizing it, and a lot of it's about the kingdom of heaven and how we live in the world. And some of you may have been tracking along, and some of you maybe are just here for the first time are thinking, what's the kingdom of heaven? What are you talking about? So let me just give you like a little brief working definition, and we're going to talk about how 2 different groups of people translated this kingdom of heaven 2 different ways. The kingdom of heaven, as Jesus taught, and as is articulated in the Bible, is simply God's right rule and reign upon the earth. God's right rule and reign upon the earth. But here's the thing. Jesus had these guys called disciples, and there were 12 of them, and they followed him around everywhere he went. And their understanding of the kingdom was a little bit different than Jesus' understanding of the kingdom. It's actually quite shocking to read because you're tracking along with Jesus as you read, and it's like the disciples are not. And you're going to see that today. They're going to kind of fumble it today. So there's this notion of the kingdom of heaven. We're going to talk about how Jesus articulates it, but we first need to kind of assess and analyze, what did the disciples think the kingdom of heaven was? What was their mindset? What was their conception? Because we're going to see that much of it is predicated on their culture, on their religion, the culture of the day, and it's not in line with what the actual kingdom of heaven is that Jesus articulated. So here's what the disciples thought. They thought Jesus, and rightfully so, but they kind of misunderstood, was this foretold Messiah. If you've been in church for any time, you've probably heard of this. It comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed one. And that's how you would coronate a king, you would anoint them. And so Jesus, this Messiah, was foretold in the Old Testament. The prophets spoke about it, and they believed that this Mashiach, this king, would be a guy who was a son of man, but also a son of God, who was human, but also divine. And they believed that this Mashiach, this Messiah, would come from the line of David, their greatest king, and he would institute the kingdom of heaven, God's right rule and reign upon the earth. But here's the catch. They thought, and many other people like them thought, that this would take the form of some kind of a government, of some kind of like a military force. And so, by analogy, it would be like if we were conquered by Canada, okay, and the Canadians were ruling us. And it's the politest rule and reign we've ever been under. And Canada is our boss, and they conquered us. And we started telling stories about there's going to be this guy, this great general who comes from the line of George Washington. And he's going to rise up and reestablish America as a country and as a great government above all governments. That's kind of what Jesus' disciples thought Jesus was going to do, this Messiah, this role of Messiah. And so they hoped for that. And in this day and time, these disciples who were Jewish, they were tired of being oppressed and conquered by the Romans. So their hope was that this foretold Messiah, who they believed to be Jesus, they thought he was filling that role, he was the guy, that he would overthrow Rome, he would bring Israel back to a place of prominence, just like it was in the days of King David, and that this government would rule over all governments, and God would be on their side. Yes! And they would be powerful and dominant, and they would be the greatest nation upon the earth. And that was their conception of the kingdom of heaven. Well, here's the weird thing. If you read the Gospels, and especially Mark, this isn't really how Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven. Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, and he tells parables and stories, and he uses word pictures. And he says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, and it's like a narrow gate. And in order to join the kingdom of heaven, you have to be like a little child. What kind of great government and military force is composed of small children? So that doesn't really align with what the disciples thought. We have these competing stories, these competing narratives. Their culture, the culture of their day, their religious background, versus the kingdom of heaven as articulated by Jesus. And so Jesus goes on to describe the kingdom, and he says, the kingdom of heaven, it's a place where humility and grace and mercy and love, they are valued. And in fact, it's a place where the greatest are actually the least. And it's this kind of counterintuitive way of living in the world. So that's maybe what you need to really hold on to here. The disciples thought it was going to be this great government and this mighty king. But Jesus talked about the kingdom in a different way, and he said, no, God's right rule and reign is a way of living on the earth. A way of living consistently with how God created us to live. A way in which life here reflects what life will look like in heaven. I heard a pastor one time say it's like bringing a little bit of heaven to earth. I've heard another pastor say it's kind of like narrowing the margin or the width between heaven and earth. And so when we love each other well, when we show each other mercy, that's like a little glimpse of heaven. That's God's right rule and reign. And that's how Jesus talks about the kingdom. But that's not, again, what the disciples thought. So we have these competing ideologies. And that's really going to be accented in our portion today. So then, in this portion of Mark, this transitional piece where Jesus is talking about the kingdom, and it's totally going over his disciples' heads, Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem for this last section of Mark, and he predicts his death. He says he's going to be arrested when they go to Jerusalem. He's going to be tried. He's going to be crucified. He's going to be buried and then raised again. Now, here's the thing that's relevant to the story. This is not the first time Jesus has predicted this. This is not the second time Jesus has predicted this. This is the third time that Jesus had predicted this. So his disciples should be well aware at this point. Now, that's where the passage right before our passage ends. And what I really need to impress upon you, what I really need you to see, that the drama of the text is that Jesus says, I'm gonna die. And those words are left floating out there. So if this was like a movie, you'd cut scene. Or if this was a TV show, you'd go to commercial break, right? And so you're left in this tension and drama. Now, as reasonable human beings, most of us, hopefully, how would we respond to someone saying they're gonna die? Well, for the disciples, we're probably thinking, we probably have a couple of reactions. One might be complete surprise. What? We thought you were the guy. We thought you were going to win. We thought you were the Messiah, and you were going to establish us as the greatest nation. You might be kind of like shocked and incredulous. What? You might be sad. They love Jesus. They follow Jesus. You might just, what? Like, why? And they might be like overcome with sorrow about it. Or maybe they're just in like catatonic shock. What? That's how you would think they would react. You would think there would be an equal and reciprocal reaction, right? Well, here's what actually happens. And you have to see the timing of this. It's hard to pull this out when you're reading the text, but you got to see this. Jesus says, I'm going to die. And then if we pick up in Mark 10:35, his disciples, two of them, James and John, brothers, they go, hey, Jesus, can we ask you for something and you'll grant whatever we desire? Does everyone see the absurdity of this part? Jesus says, I'm going to die. And they go, hey, can we ask you a favor real quick? So by example, if I came home and I told my wife, I've got an x-ray here, and it shows I have a tumor the size of a beach ball. And then it would be similar to if she responded with, honey, I made a list of things for you to do around the house. Could you please get on them? That's cold. And it's completely tone deaf. Like, what? Did you not hear what I just said? Yeah, I'm gonna need you to regrout the kitchen, please. Thank you. Before, the whole balloon tumor thing, yeah. Completely insensitive, completely tone deaf. Or it'd be like someone coming up to you and saying, hey, I lost my job. I feel you. Like, hey, I lost my job. The bank's repoing my house, my car, my kids. Just kidding, you can't repossess kids. That's a joke. It's like someone telling you that and then you responding with, hey man, can I borrow some money? You owe me some money. Do you mind? Can you bring that back to me? Completely insensitive, completely tone deaf. And so as we're reading this, we should see the absurdity of this situation. The disciples are not getting it. And so let's look at what they ask Jesus. They say, now, if we go to verse 35, look at, it says want here. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you. And then Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? Jesus is way more patient than I am. He actually goes, okay, what do you want? Now this word want, it's good. I feel like it's not strong enough. In Greek, it's this word thelo. It's a verb. Everyone say thelo. Thelo. And thelo means to desire. And I said earlier, we're going to talk a lot about desire and the things we desire today. They are talking about what they truly desire. Like their deepest desires, their greatest want. And here's what they want. They ask Jesus, they say, hey, can we sit at your left and your right hand in glory? Now, again, if you're reading this in your personal Bible study, you might be thinking, what are they talking about, left and right hand in glory? Well, the word glory here is a reference to this kingdom of heaven that they believed was going to take place with Jesus, this governmental rule. And in fact, in Matthew's gospel, he uses the word, Ben taught us this word a couple weeks ago, basileia. And they actually ask, can we sit at your left and right hand side in your kingdom? So here's essentially what the disciples are asking. As Jesus predicts his death, they say, hey, can we have a position of power in this government you're going to set up? Can we sit at your left and right hand side? Because in this day and this culture, a ruler would sit on a throne, and the person to their left and the person to their right would be people of greatness and power and authority. And so that's what they're asking for. We see what they truly desire. They want greatness and power. They don't care. They've missed all of Jesus' teachings about how to live in the world. They've completely missed that he just foretold his death. They want greatness. They want power. And they're living in this culture of the day rather than the kingdom of heaven. These competing ideologies, these clashing narratives. And so like a good teacher, like a good parent, when your kids do something that's kind of dumb, or your students completely miss something, you recognize it as a teachable moment, right? Teachable moment. So Jesus uses this as a teachable moment. And so we're actually going to go to verse 42. Let's throw that up there. Jesus says, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Now, once again, we read this and we might not know what Jesus is talking about. Well, a Gentile is a non-Jewish person. Jesus and his disciples were Jewish. So a Gentile is a non-Jewish person. And in this day and in this time, the world was ruled by the Roman Empire, this Gentile nation. And every aspect and every facet of society was dominated by two things: Roman government and Roman culture, or what you would call Greco-Roman culture. It was pervasive, and it affected every aspect of life. And so what Jesus is going to do is he's going to set up a foil and a contrast of these competing ideologies, the culture of the day versus the kingdom of heaven. And so Jesus is going to talk about what the culture of the day is. Now, as we talk about this should be helpful to you when you're doing your Bible study. You need to know what the world was like in Jesus' day so you can understand what he's talking about. So this reference to Gentiles is Roman government and Roman society. And I need to just teach you a couple things about this. In Roman society of the day, these great ones, people that were considered great, were people like benefactors. Now, we don't really use this term very often, but in Rome, there is a certain kind of person called a benefactor. Everyone say benefactor. Okay, a benefactor was usually a very wealthy person. Sometimes he was like a former military hero or like someone who was super famous. And what a benefactor would do is he would do something great for a city, like build a fountain, build a road, build some kind of a facility for the town to use. But then, nothing was free. This culture was predicated on reciprocity. What he would expect in return is for people to praise him and thank him and consider him great. And so this culture of reciprocity was like the bedrock of this Roman culture. So me as a benefactor, I seem like I'm doing something really nice. I just built a new road for you guys. You're welcome. But also I expect you to praise and laud me and give me adulation and tell me how wonderful I am. There's this other member of society, this other tier of Roman society, known as a patron. Everyone say patron. And a patron was someone who, again, was really wealthy, really affluent, and what a patron would do is he would find a client and he would lend them some money, and again, nothing is free. And so what a patron could do is lend you money, and then you're off to buy whatever you want. Sweet, thanks. And you're gonna go do whatever you want. But then they could come back around and be like, hey man, you owe me money. And I might have caught you at a bad time as a patron, and as a client, you might think like, huh, what? I can't pay you back. So then what I could do is I could exploit our relationship. So this culture not only kind of bedrocked and predicated on reciprocity, but on exploitation. So I could exploit you and say, okay, well now you owe me a favor, and you have to do whatever I say. One of my seminary professors was teaching us about this, and he likened it to the Godfather. So it's like the Godfather lends you money, and then he can come shake you down for it any time, and if you can't pay, man, he owns you. And in Greco-Roman society, in this Roman culture of the day, this patron could say, okay, well, I need you to go commit this crime for me, so I'm not guilty of it. And that's how you'll pay me back. Or your second option, okay, you have to become my servant or my slave and work for me, and you'll pay off your debt that way. You're welcome. Again, there's this culture of reciprocity. Nothing was free, and you tried to always get what you could from people, and you always tried to exploit those lesser than you so that you could be greater. And in Roman society, man, they had a high value on honor and where you stacked up socially. And that's why Jesus is speaking to this. He talks about their great ones. They're people who seem to rule. Because in Roman society, you wanted to be a great one. You wanted to have honor. That was the greatest good, greatest gain. So that was the Roman culture that Jesus is referring to. But also in the background here, as Jesus is using this foil character, if you will, there's the Roman government. And the Roman government dominated every aspect of life. Caesar would come through, conquer a place, and he would allow his soldiers to take some spoils of war, and part of the spoils of war could be people. So if we conquered your people, I could be like, okay, you're gonna come be my servant now. I'm a Roman soldier, we conquered you, you come work for me. Once more, Caesar would not only let his soldiers kind of take some spoils of war, but he would impose a heavy tax and require tribute from the people. And so if you couldn't pay it, guess what? You oftentimes had to go into slavery. You had to become someone's servant in order to make money to pay it off. So all these systems and structures of power and oppression and dominance were all predicated on reciprocity, exploiting people, taking advantage, holding people down, and making people work for you so that you could become greater. And in fact, as you saw, slavery and servanthood was kind of the end game for a lot of these unfortunate people. Well, in Roman society, the more slaves and servants you had, the greater you were considered. You were considered to be affluent and have lots of honor because, oh man, that guy's got a lot of servants. So this is what the culture of the day was about, and that's what they were chasing. And then Jesus uses this strong phrase, and I love it. He says, that's what they're doing, and then he says, in verse 43, he says, not so with you. Not so with you. Jesus provides this like really harsh contrast. He lays it down. So let's go to 43. So he says, but whoever would be great among you must be your servant. What? And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. What? Run that back again? And Jesus is using this parallelism here. Okay, culture of the day is all about greatness. If you want to be great, you have to become a servant. If you want to become first, you have to become a slave. This defies logic. This would kind of like rewire their brain. Wait, no, the culture of the day, the framing narrative is that we want greatness. And Jesus says, no, not so with you. You're going to pursue something else. This is what kingdom living looks like. Now, here's what's really interesting. The word for servant here is this Greek word diakonos. And what a diakonos was is put like a personal chef, a maid, and a butler together. That would kind of be like a diakonos. It's someone who is like a household servant who would wait on you hand and foot and who would serve you meals. That's not a position of honor in Roman society. That's like lower down the ladder. Then, you see this word first here. It's this word protos, which can also mean not first as in like order of things, but in rank. If you want to be the first, you have to be a slave. And the word for slave here is doulos. And doulos was a little bit different even than a house servant. A doulos was a slave. It was literally the lowest of the low status. Now, slavery in this day was a little bit different than in our unfortunate history, but it still was the lowest rung of the ladder in the society. Now, as a slave, you could earn your own freedom. You could work it off. Sometimes at age 30, you could free yourself. Sometimes after 7 years, you could free yourself. But this was the lowest rung of society. So in the culture of the day, you're trying to get to the highest rung of society. Jesus is saying, no, you have to go to the lowest rung of society. What? But here's what's crazy contextually and historically. All these systems of power that existed in the day that tried to exploit people and hold people down and take advantage, they created lots of slaves and servants. As a matter of fact, because of this Roman culture and because of the taxes and the tribute that Caesar required that sometimes people couldn't pay, historians say that, this is going to be shocking, try to remember this, 2/3 of the world were slaves at this point, or servants. That's a shocking stat. 2/3 of the world. And so Jesus is making this appeal. He's saying, no, don't try to be like one of these patrons or benefactors or a soldier or Caesar. No, be like a servant or a slave. Well, guess what audience that would have resonated with? Servants and slaves. Legit 2/3 of the world's population at this time. So with Jesus' words here, this was good news for those who are at the bottom rung of society, because the kingdom of heaven was different from the kingdoms of this world. The kingdoms of this world, the culture of this day, was about greatness. The kingdom of heaven was for the poor and the powerless and the marginalized and the oppressed. And that's who Jesus had good news for. And in fact, Jesus' first sermon ever, he says, hey, I've come to declare good news for the poor and freedom for the captives. Now, let's look at the very end of this verse. Not only is this good news for someone who happened to find themselves in slavery or servanthood in this Greco-Roman culture, but he goes on to say something more profound. So let's hit the next verse. He gives himself as an example. He says, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now here's what's crazy. In most religions in the world, the founder of the religion, if you will, usually doesn't do what they tell other people to do. They usually have people do that for them. Most cults are like that. People go to do stuff for them. Jesus is setting himself up as the ultimate example. Jesus says, I did not come, the Son of Man that you're expecting, this Messiah, that Son of Man is a reference to the Messiah. The Son of Man that you're expecting did not come to be served. He came to serve. He did not come to be served, he came to serve. Again, this defied sensibilities, because what did the disciples want? They wanted someone to come and conquer and rule and be served and be king. And Jesus is like, no, I didn't come for that. I came to serve. And Jesus is inclined and moves towards the slave and the servant. But then, there's better news than this. And Jesus ends the passage with something that projects further into the future. And he says, to give his life as a ransom for many. Now here's what's interesting. Jesus picks up on the servanthood and slave motif and imagery and uses this word ransom. Now when we see the word ransom, we probably think about like a kidnapping, right? Like, okay, someone kidnaps someone and you have to pay some money to get them back. Well, the word in Greek here is lutros, and what lutros was is it was a payment to free a slave. So again, in this culture where 2/3 of the world's population were slaves and servants, Jesus is proclaiming good news for the slaves and the servants, and he says, you know what? I've come to give a ransom, to give a slave's free payment for many. Again, this is good news. So not only, and this is what's so strange, Jesus is not only calling his disciples to not be like the culture of the day and to be slaves and servants, but he's going on to say, and actually I'm the one to free you from your true slavery. Now, what is Jesus referring to here? Well, if you read the wider context of Mark, we know that as people, as human beings, we fail and we falter, and more often than not, we cooperate and contribute with the culture of the day, these systems of power, these systems of oppression. And because of that, God in his justice is not okay with that. And so we've talked about this before. There has to be some kind of objective punishment for sin, some just retribution. And so the punishment that was due to all of us, Jesus would step in and take. And he offers himself, and he offers us payment for our slavery to this punishment that is due to us. And so by saying this, it's really strange. Jesus is basically saying you should be a slave and a servant, but also I'm freeing you of your true slavery and your true servanthood. And so what Jesus is essentially doing is he's calling his disciples to be servants and slaves, but they're free slaves and willing servants. As his followers, they follow Jesus in serving others and being the slave of all, but they're free to do so. And this has implications for us today. So as we try to serve and try to sacrifice for others, we don't do it as a means of paying God back for anything. We don't do it as a means of earning God's favor. We don't do it out of guilt or fear or obligation. We do it from freedom, from a place of freedom, knowing that we have right standing with God and we have been called to follow Jesus in serving others. And so that's kind of our takeaway. Let's hit it. For today, we are free to serve like Jesus. And if we're Christians, we want to be where Jesus is. We want to do what Jesus did. That's kind of what being a Christian is. And it's like, what's he doing? Where's he going? Well, Jesus is going to always be in the place of serving and sacrificing. And so we follow Jesus in that. And again, we do so as free slaves and willing servants, knowing we have right standing with God. We just follow Jesus to help foster and grow and bring the kingdom of heaven in our midst and to bear right now in the here and now. So what does this look like for in our everyday life? What does this look like? Because we have the culture of this day that's about greatness, and then we have the kingdom of heaven, and we find ourselves often in between. What do we do with this? Well, let's just look at our relationships, be it marriage, friendship, whatever it is. In our relationships, what would it look like if we put serving as the highest value? If we valued serving rather than being served, if we valued sacrificing for others rather than being great ourselves. Well, let's just look at like interpersonal relationships. If you are constantly competing with the person across from you, if you're constantly trying to, just like this Roman culture, exercise authority over someone or overpower someone, that's not a Jesus thing. That's the culture of the day. You got to win an argument. You got to have the last word. You got to exert your power and your authority over someone. That's not a Jesus thing. The Jesus thing to do would be the first one to sacrifice, to be the one to serve the others. And the healthiest relationships I've ever seen, there's this like mutual serving one another. So let's just look at like marriage or dating or whatever. If your sole concern is to serve the other person, like Jesus served and called us to serve. And if the other person's sole aim was to follow Jesus and serve the other person, well, there's overlap there, so nothing gets lost. Each of you is trying to serve the other. Each of you is looking out for the need of the other, so nothing goes unmet. Needs don't go unmet. Or, no relationship is perfect. It's easier to come to a place of compromise, to find a middle ground, to find a middle road. So again, couples in the room, are you always trying to get that last word or to exercise authority over or try to belittle someone or be like, well, I make all the money or, well, I call all the shots? Or are you endeavoring to serve the other person? And it goes both ways. And kind of related to this is this discussion Paul has in Ephesians. And this is actually something a lot of people don't like in the Bible that I think they need to kind of reassess. Paul has this teaching where he says that the man is the head of the household. And he says, wives, submit to your husbands. And I know women that hear that and they're like, what did you say? Submit what? I'm not ready to submit my foot, right? Like they're not feeling it. But you have to read the whole passage and you have to read it in context. And you know what? To be fair, I've heard men say like, yeah, I'm head of the household, so you gotta do what I say. I have final word on everything. I have final say on everything. And this is exploitative, just like the Greco-Roman culture of Jesus' day. It's exploitative, it's overpowering. I always tell dudes, Why don't you go ahead and read the rest of that? And women are called to submit to their husbands, but you know what husbands are called to do? They're called to love their wives like Christ loved the church and to lay down their lives for their wives. So I always tell dudes who try to be exploitative and authoritarian in this, I'm like, yeah, it says your wife has to submit to you, but also you have to die for her. It's on you. Like, you have to be the one to make the ultimate sacrifice. You have to be the one willing to lay everything down. So in our relationships, if we take this mindset of service, being the servant of all, being the slave of all, into our relationships, we no longer grasp for systems of power and say, I have authority over you. And we no longer try to exploit and get from the other person what we want. No, we seek to serve them, to lay down for them, to sacrifice for them. The most beautiful, healthy relationships I've ever seen are exactly this way. Let's talk about our jobs. How does this work at your work? Because the workforce, the job market, it's the most competitive field. And we're taught from a very young age, work harder than everybody else, be faster than everybody else, be smarter than everybody else, push people out of your way, bite, scratch, claw, suck up to someone, buy them something, whatever it takes to get to the top. That's not really a Jesus narrative. It's good to work hard. It's okay to want to move up in your company, but if you do it in kind of a gross way, exploitative way, it's ill-gotten gain. It's like you don't want to get it that way. Rather, what Jesus calls us to do at our jobs is to be the servant of all. Maybe you need to be the person at your work, you need to be the person in your office who's there for everybody else, who's willing to serve others, who's willing to look out for others. Maybe you're the office encourager. Maybe you're the one to say, hey, I got your back on this, or hey, I know you're going through a hard time. You want to talk about it? That's more of the Jesus thing to do. If you just so happen to work your way up that way, that's cool. But Jesus is more concerned about the method and the means. The other side of the coin, though, a lot of you in here are business owners. You're really high up in certain companies. Maybe you have lots of employees working under you. I'll tell you this. One of the best ways to ruin your witness is to be a terrible boss. I have people come to me and talk to me about this all the time. But one of the best things you can do to kind of bring the kingdom of heaven into your workplace is to be Jesus-like in the way that you serve your employees and those beneath you. And so again, society teaches us that like, well, you know, you're great, you have to carry yourself a certain way, but little people talk down to people, and that will show them that you have power and authority. That's not a Jesus thing. If you have a position of power at work, you have that position. You don't have to act a fool about it. In fact, you should endeavor to serve your employees. Everyone loves that show, Undercover Boss, right? Because like the top dog always goes in and like mingles amongst the commoners and does nice things for his employees. And something about that always stirs our heart. And we're like, that's really kind, that's really nice. Well, yeah, kingdom of heaven stuff always stirs our heart. Because when we see it, we go, oh yeah, that's how it's supposed to look. And that's what a lot of Jesus' teaching is about. Yeah, that is how it's supposed to look. So at your job, how can you do this? Just brief anecdote about this. I was interning at this church one time, and it was early on in ministry, and I was super ambitious. I had just started seminary, and I'm like, man, I want a church of like 8 million people, and I want to baptize the entire northern hemisphere, and I was like about it, and I was passionate, and I was fiery. And then I was a 27-year-old intern with a bunch of college kids at a church, and I felt like a weirdo, because like there was like these, you know, sophomores in college, and then like this 27-year-old man who was an intern, getting paid like nothing. And I remember in my time serving, I kept getting discouraged because I'm like, I have no power, no authority, no say, no opportunities, I don't matter. And God started getting a hold of me. And so what I did, I had to slowly rewire my brain and change my perspective. And instead of trying to work up to a certain position or grasp for something, like the culture of our day would say, go get it. Move up, work your way up. I decided to take the Jesus way and to become the servant of all. So I'd pray every day before I went into work, how can I be the servant of all? How can I serve well? And that started to be kind of my litmus test for whether or not I was doing a good job. And I remember we had this big outdoor event at this church. Tons of people were there, and each of us was assigned a job. And I was put in charge with my boss of trash for like probably 4,000 people at this event. And I had to make sure the trash cans were taken care of and weren't overflowing. So as a guy who was like ambitious, just starting seminary, who was like, I want to be a lead pastor of 8 million people. I was lead pastor of like 20 trash bins. But here's what I told myself. Taking the Jesus way, being the servant of all, I said, you know what? I'm gonna be the best trash pastor of all time. I wanted to get like a little trash bag as a cape and just be like, trash pastor, away! Like I was about it. I was fiery about it. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to strive for greatness. I'm going to endeavor to serve. And I ran around, man, I was covered in trash juice and sweat. And by the end of it, I don't know what was running down my brow into my mouth. I'm just gonna pray it was sweat. And I remember I was picking up this bag, this really heavy bag of trash. I was exhausted. And like the lead pastor and like the executive pastor were right over here, and they didn't see what I was doing. I wasn't trying to impress them. And I probably wouldn't have, anyway, they probably would have been like, dude, you smell. Can you like, your mind a little bit? And I was picking up this trash bag, and this sweet old lady looked at me, and she just goes, you are working so hard. And it was just these simple words, you are working so hard. And I get a good sense of validation if someone's like, hey, good sermon, or hey, good music today. I'm like, okay, cool, thank you. But that remark really hit me. Because I was endeavoring to serve, and someone said, hey, you're serving well. You're being the best trash pastor here. And that stood out to me. And that meant a lot to me. And nobody else knows what I was doing. It's just between me and God. It was just part of worship, man. So what would it look like for us in our relationships if we don't follow the pattern of this day, having to win, having to be the greatest of all? What would it look like if we just endeavored to sacrifice and to serve the other? What would it look like in our jobs if we didn't try to push people and bite and crawl and scratch away to the top, but instead just demonstrated servant leadership and just went into work every day and said, you know what, I'm not gonna get stressed about the stuff I can't control, I'm just gonna serve well. And what lastly would it look like as a church if instead of getting caught up in a lot of the things churches get caught up in, if we made our central framing question, how are we serving? How are we serving as a pastoral staff? How are we serving you guys? As the congregation, how are you serving one another? And as a church, how are we serving the community? This service, this perspective and mindset for service, this is integral and central to being a Jesus follower. And we are free to serve without obligation or fear or guilt as we follow Jesus. And so lastly, I submit to you this, that a life well lived is a life of service. A life well lived is a life of service. There's this comedic actor I love. You've probably heard of him. His name is Jim Carrey. Show of hands, who's heard of Jim Carrey? All right, real quick cultural study. What's everyone's favorite Jim Carrey movie? Just yell it out. Everyone says Dumb and Dumber all the time. That's everyone's favorite movie of his. I'm all about that Grinch life. I love that Grinch that stole Christmas. That's my favorite Jim Carrey movie. And I heard Jim Carrey say this in a candid interview. He said, I think everybody should become rich and famous, and that they should achieve all of their dreams so that they see that that is not the answer. Jim Carrey's made a bajillion movies and made $1 bajillion. And he said, I think everyone should get rich and famous and fulfill all their dreams so that they see it's not the answer. And in the culture of the day, it's all about greatness and fame and power and money. And Jim Carrey said, did it, done it, got it. It's not the answer. And that's why so many celebrities you hear are depressed, and there's been this horrible wave of suicides among celebrities because they worked their way to the top of this culture of the day, just like in Jesus' time, like these benefactors and patrons and Roman rulers. And they worked their way to the top and they realized there's nowhere else to go and I'm still not happy. That's the culture of this day. But Jesus calls us, actually in Mark 8, just right before our passage, he said, if you want to follow me, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. He says, what good is it to gain the whole world and lose your own soul? And he goes on to say things like, if you try to find and save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. And some of the most content most satisfied people I've ever known have lived lives of service to others. I was, this is something you do as a pastor apparently. I was reading deathbed quotes from missionaries the other day. Anybody else here read that? Show of hands. Yeah, okay. Some lighter fare as I'm going to bed. No single missionary quote. These are people that served in jungles and probably got yellow fever and malaria. Not a single missionary said, I should have gone into finance. They all spoke with such contentment, such peace, and such purpose. I've never known someone that laid down their life to be the slave and servant of all who lived to regret it. So today, we find ourselves right in the middle of these competing narratives, these competing ideologies of the culture of this day and the kingdom of heaven. And we get to decide, are we going to chase after greatness as defined by our culture? Are we going to try to live in the kingdom of heaven, build the kingdom of heaven, bring a little bit of heaven into every single moment we live? And I think there's freedom in this because we feel constant pressure from our culture to strive more and to achieve. Some of us had parents that said, you're not going to amount to anything. You have to prove to me you can. Or some of us have financial debt and obligation that we're like, I have to keep making money so I can pay this off, and there's this vicious cycle. Maybe our mindset's wrong. Maybe that just exacerbates stress. I suggest instead, we take on the mind of Christ, like Paul says in Philippians, and we endeavor to make our entire lives about serving others and about building the kingdom. So Hope Church, as a culture of the day pursues greatness, not so with you. As a culture of the day pursues fame, not so with you. As a culture of the day pursues power and winning and dominance and exploitation, not so with you. Rather, we realize what Christ has done on our behalf. We realize what Christ has called us to do and exemplified for us. And we live as free slaves and willing servants. And we realize that the least is greater than the greatest. And so we commit our lives to serving. Let's pray.